coming from us. I've got all sorts of things popping up on my screen here. How's everyone doing tonight? Let's see how many people we have here so far. Hello from Los Angeles. That's very close to me. And and things are starting up on Facebook as well, and on YouTube.
Hey, Linda.
Starting up on I gotta turn my sound. Oh, good. Mission Viejo, South Carolina, Walnut Creek, California. We're getting a lot of California people. We must have only used local mail.
Lots of California people.
I love the California people too, because we're always so happy because it's always so beautiful here.
Oh, hey, John from Hampton. I know John. It's good to see some familiar names in here.
Well, you know, if they see that you're going to be on Nisi TV, they're certainly going to check in. Let's see, I'm going to get Facebook rolling as well so I can watch that. And we're all good. See, it actually is 5 o'clock. Looks like we've got about 30 people so far. That's not too bad. This makes it a little more intimate. Again, I'm going to ask you to please, 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 please turn your cameras off, turn your microphones off. However, we are going to be a little looser this time, and we might stop rather than waiting until the end of the webinar for asking questions. We might stop. We are going to stop periodically, and you guys can actually ask questions live as we're on. So before I turn it over to Talor, let me just do my typical commercial. We are doing, here it comes, it's going to be here. We're doing 15% off on all Nisi, even our lenses, even our new 9mm lens for APS-C cameras. So those of you who shoot Fujifilm XT cameras, those of you who shoot Sony APS-C, Nikon Z, Canon RF APS-C, Micro Four Thirds, and am I missing one? I don't think I am missing one, but maybe I am. Anyway, 15% off of all Nisi by just using the coupon Live 15 Talor 22, and that coupon is good until November 23rd. So please take advantage of that. And then we also have Explorer. Explorer are some fabulous tripods. As a matter of fact, I want Talor to spend at least 45 minutes of the webinar talking about how she loves her Explorer tripod that we had her test out for us. We're really starting to get a name for ourselves on that, and it is a pretty fabulous line of tripods that are compact, lightweight, but very, very strong and very flexible, where they can go from very low angle to the ground up to our ascent, can easily accommodate a man that's greater than 6 foot tall. And they all compact down so that you can carry them in carry-on luggage. And they're extremely lightweight. We don't have a tripod that weighs much more than 4 pounds, so that's pretty good. They're all 10-layer carbon fiber, so they are rock solid. But like I said, Talor's going to spend 45 minutes at least tonight. No, she's not. No, she's not. Maybe she'll mention it for a second, just to make me happy. And that's it. We also think you should follow us on Instagram at Nisi Optics USA and at Explorer Photo Video, because we have a few new things coming your way that I think that you'll be really happy that we brought them to the market. They're going to solve some problems that in a new way that people really haven't thought about. And it's pretty cool stuff that we're going to be introducing in the next week or two. So there we go. I'm going to turn it over to Taylor. And Taylor, thank you very much. It's great to see you again. And you go.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It's really good to be presenting for Nisi again. It's been a busy year, so I'm finally able to get back and do some webinars for you guys. So thank you so much for joining me. I am going to just go ahead and share my screen. So give me one moment. And you should be able to see the presentation now. So today we're going to be talking about capturing the passage of time. And this is a concept that I like to introduce a lot in workshops. I take a lot of long exposure type photos, and I really love teaching this technique. And I teach it in a way that I hope gets people really excited about this skill, because there's a lot more to it than it appears on the surface. So as I'm presenting, I really want people to please feel free to put questions in the chat. I would love to be able to make this interactive so that we can address your questions as they come up throughout the presentation. It's much better to do that than just monologue for you guys. So feel free to speak up at any time. So the presentation is broken down into three concepts. And the first one is introducing just the idea of capturing time, what I mean when I say that. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about a passion project that I started and how that shaped the way that I think about long exposures. And of course, I'll wrap up by talking about my specific field process and some of the tools that you'll need to get the job done. So if you haven't met me before, a little bit about myself. I came to photography a little bit later. It was my second career. I'm also a Ph.D. researcher, so I study Greenland and Arctic cultural communities, and I am a workshop educator. I work for Muench Workshops, which is a large photography workshop company, and I love teaching in the field. And of course, I really enjoy being a Nisi ambassador and working with Jim. It's a great company, and I'm happy to represent them. And of course, if you do know me, then you know that I'm kind of just goofy, and I try and always bring a little bit of fun and playfulness whenever I'm out in the field. So those of you who have been on workshops with me, you can attest to that. So what to expect during this presentation? First off, I just want to let you know this is not a technical presentation. I'm not going to be presenting any math about how to calculate long exposures. There's a million tools already that exist to help you guys with that. So rather than address the technical aspect of it, I'll be talking about the conceptual part, which personally I think is one of the most important parts, because it's hard to execute something if you don't really understand why you're doing it to start with. And then we'll talk about elevating your images using the dimension of time, or capturing the passage of time. And ultimately, the goal is just to inspire you to get those filters and go try something new. And I hope that this makes you feel creatively stimulated and that you'll want to go out and try a new technique. So let's talk about what are the dimensions of a photo. When you're creating an image, you are taking something three-dimensional in the world, something that has depth and feel and sound and smell, and you're trying to convey whatever that moment was in a flat medium. So when you're printing an image, it's two-dimensional. You have your vertical and horizontal axes, and it's really difficult, and it requires quite a bit of planning to make that flat image feel three-dimensional and to feel real to the viewer. There are a few compositional techniques that I think we're all familiar with to help you do that. And the first one is just your basic foreground, midground, and background. You're using this to convey depth, which adds a third dimension to your image. Adding depth brings in that third dimension. There's another technique like leading lines, which again, this creates depth in your photo. So it takes a two-dimensional image and it makes it feel three-dimensional by adding depth. But my question is, what would happen if you're able to add a fourth dimension to a photo? How does that elevate that photo to the next level? And I would argue that the fourth dimension that you can include is called time. So whenever you're applying an ND filter in the field, the effect that you're after is extending your shutter speed. Anytime you apply an ND filter, you're slowing down or reducing the amount of light that can be transmitted to your sensor. And because of that, you're able to extend your shutter speed. Now, what that does is it reveals an entire world of possibilities that are not actually visible to the naked eye. You and I cannot see water that looks like that. It's just not possible because we can only see in the moment. Instead, by slowing down your shutter speed, your camera sees the passage of time, and it can see an elongated period of time that we can't even see with our own eyes. And this is one of the ways that you can include a fourth dimension of time into a two-dimensional medium, which is just still photography. So whenever you're bringing in this extra element of creativity, you're just adding a little bit of spice on top of a photo. Of course, all of the other concepts of composition still apply, but this is one technique you can use to really take it to the next level and elevate your photo. So to do this, there's some tools that you're going to need. So the first thing is that I think it's really important to have a high quality set of filters. It's why I use Nisi products and I stand by them. Having a high quality filter is vital because it's the one thing that stands between your camera and getting the shot that you're envisioning. It's this piece of glass, it's that barrier, and you want it to be the best out there because you've already spent all the money on your camera gear and all the time and all of the energy to get to that location. You really want to make sure that you're going to get the best shot. So the first tools that the order priority of tools that I use is starting with a polarizer. I love shooting with a polarizer in landscapes, especially if there's water involved. It's a really important tool. I also use a graduated filter. And you can see there's a little video clip just demonstrating the Nisi polarizer and how beautifully it saturates the colors in the landscape. A graduated filter at the bottom, you can see there's variation in type. I typically use a soft graduated filter, but there are different types for different purposes. And if you have questions about when to use which, please feel free to ask and I would be happy to explain that. The neutral density filter is also the tool that I use mostly to extend my shutter speed. And I tend to go for a 6-stop or sometimes a 3-stop ND filter. I'm often asked the question about whether I use square or round filters, and I thought that it was just good to address this in the presentation because it's a question that comes up a lot. For me, I use square filters. There are different cases to be made for whether you want square or round filters, and a lot of that depends on how you plan to use them. For me, when I am shooting long exposures, I'm often photographing water, so seascapes or waterfalls, and that requires me to stack multiple filters on top of each other. If you think you're going to be stacking filters, I highly recommend investing in a square camera or square filter system rather than a round filter system. And that's just because they're a lot more versatile for stacking. So if you have further questions about which one might be right for you, you can always contact me or ask here in this presentation. And also Jim and any of the people on the Nisi team are so knowledgeable about that, and they can really help you make the right choice for you. So when you include the element of time, it enables you to do a couple of fun things. You know, you're able to slow down water, you can create traffic trails again, more blurring of the water to remove the texture and distractions in the foreground. You can blur the clouds as they move across the sky. And of course, my very favorite thing, which is waterfalls. I love to photograph waterfalls, and understanding how to include the passage of time into that photo is the difference between getting a very basic waterfall photo and something that actually feels really powerful. Now, before I move on, I want to give a moment and just pause and see if anyone has any questions about filters or the equipment that I've already mentioned. If we don't, we can keep cruising, but Jim, did you have anything?
And do feel free to unmute your mic to ask a question, but then please put it back on mute again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if no one has any questions, I can just continue on. But again, if you do, please feel free to put them in the chat. So one of the reasons that people love getting into photography, I hear this quite a lot, is this idea that you freeze a moment in time and that you're able to take something impermanent that you experience and preserve that moment forever. And I really think that there's a lot of validity to that. But when you're taking long exposures, you're not just freezing a moment in time, you're actually capturing the passage of time and the transition of time through that moment. So I think it's a really interesting idea to be able to take something static and transition it into something that is capturing something that your eyes can't even see. Like we as humans standing in front of this waterfall cannot see what the camera can. And because of that, it really does feel like magic when you're creating a long exposure. For me, it's magical every time to be able to create a reality that I can't even appreciate in the very moment. So it elevates your image in a couple of different ways. When you add the dimension of time, you are providing contrast in your image. So in this image and many of my other ones, you have static objects like the stick in the foreground or the crisp texture of the rock. And being able to soften the water creates this textural contrast in your photo that creates a really nice sense of balance, and it's a very calming tone to that image. It also creates new compositional elements. So at a faster shutter speed, this scene doesn't have this very clean white leading line that flows through it. Instead, it would be fairly chaotic and the water wouldn't be nearly as bright. It would be much darker because the air bubbles that create the whiteness of the water haven't had time to build up on your camera sensor yet. So because of that, that leading line wouldn't be there in the same way. So when you actually slow down your shutter speed, you are able to create new compositional elements that you wouldn't have without that. You're also able to control the emotional tone of your image, which I think really interesting idea as well. You can convey whether or not you want your photo to have an action, like a very tense mood, or do you want it to be very calming and relaxing and ethereal? And when you take the time to actually consider how you want to convey that tone, it allows you to think about in what way you would like to slow down the shutter speed or include the element of time. And of course, my favorite part, it is magic as far as I'm concerned, because when you slow down your shutter speed and include time in your photo, allowing the people who are viewing your photo to time travel with you in that moment. So they're seeing the passage of time in a way that you can't even experience when you're standing right in front of that object. And I think that's pretty amazing. Yeah. So ultimately, you're going to create an image that can be nothing short of magic. And I think it really has an extra bit of punch when you create these types of photos. So just to demonstrate the difference between shutter speeds and how much of a difference it can make in a single photo, these are the exact same scene taken back to back, different shutter speeds, and you can see the way in which slowing down the shutter speed completely alters the tone and the mood of the image, where you have static clouds or you could have them streaking across the sky, and it gives you a very different sensation in that photo. So it's important to critically think before you take a photo about what message you want to convey, and that way you're able to best apply your filters in the field to achieve that desired effect. All right. So I want to take a little break here and talk about a passion project that I started in 2020. I think a lot of us started passion projects during the pandemic, and I was no different than you guys. So of course, 2020 wasn't really a normal year. Everything got pretty disrupted in my life and everyone else's lives. And I found that I needed some type of passion project to keep myself grounded in photography and really engaged with this artistic experience that I love. So it gave me time to shoot just for the joy of it. Normally I'm traveling and shooting and working with clients, and I love all of that, but it does make it hard for me to shoot just for the fun of it. And this was a really good chance for me to do that. And also, of course, reevaluate my relationship with nature and photography. So one of the things I noticed in 2020 is that perception of time is very fluid, it kind of was very weird that year. For some people, it may have felt like a blur, like that whole year just went by in a flash. But for other people, it may have been painfully slow when you're stuck at home and it's just a year that wouldn't end. I thought that that was an interesting experience because I was discussing it with some of my friends, how we were all perceiving the pandemic a little differently. And I wanted to explore that idea with my camera. How do you convey the message of time in a photo? And the way that I did that is that I went to the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's very close to where I live. It's actually fairly remote. And I knew that I would be able to go undertake this personal project safely on my own. It's also a haven for long exposures. Who doesn't like a waterfall? I mean, waterfalls are amazing. And this was a really good opportunity for me to go somewhere and absolutely just perfect something that I really wanted to work on. And of course, I needed redemption because the year before I was up shooting in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And of course, my camera went over a waterfall. So I needed to go back and, come face to face with these waterfalls again and redeem myself. This is my camera and a bag of rice. And no, it didn't work. It was a good try though. So the goal of the project was simple. I just wanted to connect with nature. I wanted to shoot for the love of it. And I wanted to really perfect this technique of photographing time. And I learned a lot about it. I mean, before going and undertaking this project, I felt comfortable taking long exposures. It's not the first time I've photographed waterfalls. It's not the first time I used an ND filter. But having this dedicated time to really perfect a specific skill and forcing myself to do it day after day, that was an amazing experience. And it really helped me fine tune the way that I approach this in the field. So the end result of the project is I spent a total of 8 weeks in the field. And in that time, I saw a little over 200 waterfalls, which I know is hard to believe. Trust me, my legs felt the same way. It was a lot of hiking. I created amazing memories. I had quite a few hilarious encounters too. I created a new appreciation for this area that I'm absolutely in love with now. And I feel extremely confident shooting long exposures and also teaching others these same skills. And of course, there's a free guidebook now on my website of some of my favorite lesser known Blue Ridge waterfalls. So if you go on the website, you can just download it for free. So after this project, I thought a lot about what I had learned, and I kind of broke it down into 5 main steps for my process in the field. And some of it might seem a little bit obvious, but trust me, it's a little more involved than that. So the first part is that time of day matters. And I think we all know this, right? If we are out shooting, we know that it matters what time of day you go to a place, but it really matters when you're talking about waterfalls. I always would research in advance and figure out whether the waterfall was north facing, south facing, east or west, because if there's direct sunlight on that water, the bottom line is you are not going to be able to get a good picture of that waterfall. And it doesn't matter. There's no ND filter in the world that can help you. You have to make sure that there's not direct sunlight on that water, or it is not going to be a great picture. So when you're photographing water, in particular, moving water like waterfalls or seascapes, direct light is the enemy. And so you really need to plan in advance in a way that's even more rigorous than traditional landscape photography. The second part is just finding your composition. And this is where the tripod comes in, Jem. I know you're going to love that. Having a good tripod means a great deal when you're shooting in especially wet environments or moving water. I can't tell you enough how important it is to have a really good tripod. And I do love my Explorer tripod. I take it with me everywhere. So you want to find your composition, and part of taking a long exposure is understanding what I mentioned earlier, which is that you're creating a new compositional element. You are creating a new element in that photo that your eyes cannot necessarily appreciate just by looking at the scene. Your camera has to see it. And so part of doing that in, I think, a really elevated way is not just taking a long exposure simply because you can. Okay, just knowing how to do a long exposure is not necessarily enough to create a great photo. You want to use these new compositional elements that you're creating to your advantage and do it intentionally. So in this example, I have water being my mid and background. So, and I'm also using this new compositional element of the diagonal flow to the right that is, you're unable to appreciate that in the moment without the long exposure. So I'm placing this compositional element intentionally so that it flows naturally out of the corner of the image. The same in these photos, I'm using the compositional element that's being created to create flow through the image. So on the left, it creates a nice diagonal flow out. And on the right, that image, I'm using the water to actually be the subject of the photo and framing all the other elements around it. So there's different ways that you can use it, but you just want to make sure you're being very intentional with the way that you're placing these new compositional elements in your photo.
Taylor.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Hi. I just wanted to pipe in with a question before it got too far. Andrew is watching on our YouTube stream, so he can't chat. He said, one common trait I've noticed in your photography is how clean your images are without getting crunchy, in quotes. Do you do this mostly in camera? Is it the filters or post?
That's a really good question. I try and always make sure my images feel soft and dreamy. That's really what I'm going for. So occasionally I'll use some focus stacking techniques, but in general, I try and create a single shot, and the softness of the photo in part is coming from the use of filters. So creating the softness of the water, and just when I go into post-processing, I lean into that and I want it to feel soft and ethereal rather than have everything be perfectly sharp. Now, that's an artistic style that I gravitate towards. I know some people really like the super sharp images, so to each their own. But for me, when I'm talking about taking a long exposure like a waterfall, that's a beautiful scene and it's very calming and relaxing. And I want my final image in the edit that I'm producing to reflect how calming that scene is. And part of that is you let certain elements be soft. I hope that answered your question, Andrew. So continuing on, once you have found your composition, you've planned your shot, you found your composition, and you know how you want to use the elements in the scene, before you calculate anything else, go ahead and put on your polarizer, and if you need to, your graduated neutral density filter. So you want to go ahead and get those guys on before you start calculating a long exposure. It's really important to get it dialed in first. Polarizers in particular are absolutely essential for photographing water. I cannot stress that enough. There's a lot of myths about polarizers. I have an entire webinar just on the myths that surround using a polarizer. This is an essential piece of equipment and it works any time of the day, especially with waterfalls. It doesn't just have to be at noon. Okay, so please make sure that you're applying a polarizer and properly orienting it if you're photographing water. So once you've applied your filters, you have your composition, you planned your shot, the next thing you want to do is critical thinking. This is something I talk about quite a bit during my waterfall workshops that I teach, because I think there's a tendency to know you need a long exposure, but not really know how long does that exposure actually need to be, and how do you determine that? So a lot of it has to do with the rate of flow of the water. It's something I call the Goldilocks shutter speed. You can go ahead and trademark that, but it's a shutter speed that's not too fast, it's not too slow, it's just right. And let me explain why that is. The rate of flow of the water, it determines how many seconds you actually need for the water transition to build up in that image so that it creates a pleasing scene. If the water is flowing very, very fast and there's a heavy flow of water, it is going to require much less time than, say, a waterfall that is just a trickle. And you need to be thinking about this. It's best shown in an example. So this is Dry Falls in North Carolina. It is a large waterfall with a high rate of flow. And in this image, you can successfully create a long exposure at only a half second. You could probably get away with a little bit longer too, maybe 1 second. However, if you did like a 10-second exposure of this waterfall, rather than have any texture in that waterfall, it is just going to be white. That's why you really don't want to overextend your shutter speed. You need that Goldilocks shutter speed that's just right for that rate of flow of that water. In another example, this waterfall is just a trickle. There's very little water coming over these cascades. So I used an 8-second exposure, and that allowed those little trickles to build up over time and create a really nice, pleasing scene. If this exposure time was a second, for example, or less, you're not going to see all of this white transition because there just hasn't been enough time for that trickle of water to build up and create this dreamy, soft effect. So it's really important to critically think about how long you need your shutter speed to be. So on this previous one, all I used was a polarizer and a 6-stop. And on this one, again, a polarizer and a 10-stop on this image because I needed a lot more time to get the effect that I was after. So I just can't emphasize it enough. Critical thinking is a part of creating really good long exposures. You can't just go set up a tripod and just take a 10-second arbitrary exposure. You need to understand why you may want to do more or less. Was there any question, Jim, before I move on?
Gotta find my mute button. Something just came in. Oh, can you type the link and code for the tripod? All I see are filters on your site. I will take care, not even the macro.
Thanks, Jim.
I'll take care of that. So, but any other questions anyone might have at this moment?
All right. Well, if not, we'll just
there you go.
Keep on going. We're very near the end. So once you have figured out about how long your shutter speed needs to be, and this does become intuitive, like there's no math equation to know whether you need an 8-second or a half-second exposure based on the waterfall. This is just, it becomes intuitive with experience. You just have to go out and practice and just do it. Remember, if it's a heavy flowing waterfall, a shorter exposure time is good. If you have a very lightly flowing waterfall, you'll need a longer one. And based off of that knowledge, then you can figure out about what strength ND filter you might need. Now, there are many ways to calculate your exposure time. There's a bunch of apps. In fact, Nisi makes an app to help you calculate how many seconds your exposure time needs to be. However, I will say that in most cases, if you have a mirrorless camera in particular, just use live view. Your eyes will tell you what the correct exposure time is because it will do the exposure simulation for you in live view. The same goes for a DSLR. It can meter through a lot of those filters. So as long as it's not too dark and you're using a 3 or 6-stop, it's going to meter just fine through that. So I would just urge you not to overcomplicate the issue. A little bit of trial and error is fine. And also there are apps if you feel like you need an additional resource to calculate your exposure time properly. But in most cases, again, live view is going to be just fine. Just use your eyes. It's going to work out. So essentially, the bottom line with this is that when you add the 4th dimension, which is time, to your image, it can be a really powerful effect. You're taking your photo from this 2-dimensional flat object. Hopefully, you've already applied good depth technique with your composition so that you have a 3rd dimension. And then by lengthening your exposure time, you're adding a 4th, which is time. And by doing that, you've created something really dynamic and immersive that people can time travel into. And you really want people to be able to connect with that photo and feel this type of special connection or this ethereal sense from your images. And controlling time and how time is interpreted is a really important aspect of getting someone to connect with your photo at the tone and emotion that you want. It's a way that you can take artistic power over your photo and convey the message that you're actually after. I also just want to stress that passion projects are such good ways to learn something. It's a really good way to learn something new and dedicate times to specific techniques. In my case, I took a pretty preliminary knowledge of long exposures, and I feel like I've elevated that knowledge to a degree that I'm really, really happy with where I'm at. And I feel very comfortable teaching it now. And that's an amazing thing. So I encourage you, if you have a technique you want to master, go out, start a passion project, and dedicate some time to it so you can really accelerate your learning. And of course, having the right tools makes a huge difference, especially when it comes to long exposures. You don't want to have something, the only thing between your camera and that photo, not be a high quality piece of glass. So I do recommend investing in really high quality filters. I've tried a lot of them, and I think Nisi makes the best. So shameless plug for you guys, Jim. And now I just want to open up to questions. So if anyone has questions, I would love to answer them. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Okay.
I'm going to ask for this person. So if you are doing a longer shutter for water, like 8 seconds, do you take a separate picture to prevent all the movement in the leaves, then blend in Photoshop? Or are you trying to get a balance for a single shot? That's a
That
great
is
question.
such a good question. That's a really good one. Yeah, so it depends on the situation. There are a couple of techniques to overcome this really frustrating challenge. So anyone who has photographed a waterfall, they're usually surrounded by vegetation. You absolutely know there's going to be movement, especially if you're doing a longer shutter speed, and you could have blurry leaves everywhere. It can be so distracting. So in that situation, what I normally do is exactly what this writer mentioned. I can take 2 different pictures, one with the long exposure and one at a faster shutter speed, and I can blend them together in Photoshop. Another technique that helps you do that, this is really important, is that if you are going to blend these photos, you have to make sure that the blurred leaves are not over any of the water that you want to keep in your image. It is going to be a nightmare to blend that together later if you don't maneuver yourself in a way that the foliage is not on top of the water. I can assure you, you can thank me later because that is a nightmare to try and edit together. Sometimes it's not possible though. That's just the reality. Sometimes it is not possible to compose the scene in a way that moving foliage is not obscuring part of the waterfall. And when that happens, I always go for the minimum amount of time required to get a good long exposure. So, maybe I think it's about an 8-second exposure, and I will walk that down to 6 seconds, 4 seconds until I'm at the very minimum amount of time. So I get the least movement possible. And then I just let it be, because that's real life and plants move. And, that's just part of it. It's part of the experience. It's part of feeling that shot and someone else experiencing that moment. So I try not to obsess about whether or not it's just perfectly sharp in the foliage. If it's unavoidable, sometimes it just is, and that's nature. And I'm willing to let nature just be nature. So I hope that helps.
I'm scanning.
Discuss the use of gradual neutral grad filters.
Okay, I can definitely do that. So particularly this could be handy in many cases, but let's just stick with waterfalls as an example. So waterfalls, when you're shooting a waterfall, generally there's an open area of sky directly above it. Let me share my screen again. And I can pull up one of these examples. Give me one moment. Okay. Oops. Oh boy. Sorry. I'm really screwing this up, guys. All right, so at the top of this waterfall on the left, you can see this is really, really common with waterfalls. There's going to be an open area above that waterfall. And if you are exposing for the waterfall area and the rocks, it is dark. It is surrounded by foliage. It's in a lower lying area because, well, water is falling, so it is lower. It's going to be darker down there. And that means in a single exposure or without a graduated filter, you are going to completely blow out the top of that photo. So one of the techniques to deal with that is, of course, you could take a bracketed image. You could take multiple shots and blend them together later. That can be really difficult when we're talking about moving foliage. So if there's a lot of plants and a lot of leaves, trying to create an HDR or even go into Photoshop and blend them together later, that can be really difficult because they're not going to line up perfectly. It's just not going to happen. So my go-to technique is to use a graduated neutral density filter, and I will usually use a soft filter and insert that into the filter holder so it controls the highlights at the top of the scene. And that gives me the ability to create an image in a single shot, which I find very, very satisfying. And also it prevents me from having to deal with the headache later of trying to blend together images that don't completely line up. So there are a lot of times that can be helpful, because if you're trying to create a long exposure of seascapes or anything else, there's often a brighter part of the image, and extending your shutter speed can result in you blowing out that part of the photo. So it's very helpful.
Taylor, can you do a panorama of a waterfall?
Yes, absolutely. Let me,
And you can blend the water running?
yes. So for example, let's see here. Okay, this is a panorama. This is 4 images, vertical images that are merged together. Lightroom does a fantastic job of merging it. The only thing that you need to be cautious about is if you have a graduated filter on, you should be aware that if you're moving it, for example, in this photo, I did not have a graduated filter on for this, but you just need to be self-aware that you don't want it to apply over on this right side of the photo because it will darken the top of this cave. The same goes for, let's see. This image is also a panorama. So this is, I have maybe 3 or 4 images that have been stitched together. Again, the water will blend together really nicely. Lightroom does a fantastic job with that. Now in this photo, what you would need to be careful of is your polarizer. So if you have a polarizer and you're doing a panorama, polarizers, the effect of polarization is based on the angle to the sun. So if your panorama is too far to the side, you could end up with varying degrees of polarization. It doesn't mean to not do it. It just means you need to be paying attention to that, and you should actively be thinking about whether or not you're creating a headache for yourself later on. So I hope that answers your question, Sam.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask of that image, if you go back to it for a sec.
Oh, sure.
So roughly, where are the dividing lines for the stitches?
The first one is probably, can y'all see my mouse? I don't know if you can see it or not.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so the first one is probably about here because I really wanted this continuation of the rail. And then, you know, I probably split the waterfall about in half. I'm pretty sure this is 4 photos. And I usually overlap by at least a third in my photos, particularly if I'm using a wide angle lens. There's a lot of overlap that you need to successfully do it. But I promise you, it was stitched right down the middle of that waterfall. But I mean, you genuinely, even in, let's see, this is a pano. This photo is a pano as well. This is probably 2 or 3 photos that are all stitched together. And this one is as well. So you genuinely cannot tell. As long as you're properly lining up your pano like if you're properly overlapping the photos that make up the panorama, as long as you're doing that, you're going to be fine. The water won't be an issue. So.
Fantastic.
Okay.
So we have a few more chat questions.
Sure.
Do you set up your Nisi filter holder on your camera in advance and pack it with the filter holder in place, or do you set it up at the point of need and insert filters then?
Yeah, I always carry my filters in the padded Nisi case because, well, I don't know about you, I'm really clumsy. The odds that I'm going to slip and fall down are pretty high, so I make sure that it is in a padded case and that they're well protected. It does create, you know, a little extra work when you get to the scene, but it's kind of just part of the process. And the more you use the filters, the faster you get. So I find it really doesn't slow me down anymore. It just takes practice.
Okay. I have a harder time always seeing the effect of the polarizer on the back of the camera screen to make sure I have it exactly where I want it, especially if it is brighter outside. Is there a way to see it better as you adjust it, such as bringing, wait, hold on, such as
Yeah.
bringing up or down the exposure during setup?
Okay. Yeah, I actually have a couple of tricks for this. So sometimes a polarizer doesn't have a super strong effect. A polarizer will always have some effect, but it may not be glaringly obvious to you. It can be subtle. So if you are photographing water, or if you are photographing a sky or anything, particularly water, it's really the easiest one to see. So there are two tricks that I use. The first one is if you're having a difficult time seeing it, look for something that is wet, shiny, and dark. So like a damp rock with a waterfall, anywhere that is wet, shiny, or dark. And one of the things I do is I specifically look for that area of the photo when I'm rotating the polarizer, and I rotate the polarizer quickly and aggressively. If you do it really fast, our little hunter-gatherer brains, we are programmed to see change. You will see change. If you're still having a hard time seeing a difference, zoom in. I know it sounds silly, just trust me. Zoom into that area where you're hoping to see the change, like the surface of the water or a blue part of the sky, and then go ahead and aggressively spin the polarizer, because you can zoom back out and recompose once it's aligned, but it helps if you just zoom into that element, align it, and then you can zoom back out. And the alignment of the polarizer won't change by zooming. So that's just another trick that I use, because sometimes the effect is subtle and you want to get it right. Hopefully that helps.
Okay. Nope, that was the same question. I just started reading it again. I don't see any other questions.
Awesome. Well, guys, I mean, honestly, please, if you have questions, ask me. I really want to help you guys with this. And I absolutely hope that you get out there with some filters, go create some awesome pictures, send them to me. I want to see them.
I'm going to ask you to do one other little advertisement, okay?
Oh, sure.
Will you do an advertisement about who you're working with and how people could take a trip with you?
Yeah, totally. So I work with a company called Muench Workshops. I'll just type it into the chat here. They're one of the premier photography workshop companies in the world, and they travel literally everywhere. It's pretty fabulous. And I'm so honored to get to teach with them. I teach with an amazing team of pros, and I teach about 5 or 6 waterfall workshops a year. So if the waterfall thing appeals to you, you want to come to the Blue Ridge Mountains, come with me. I mean, these are one of my favorite places in the entire world, and I would love to share them with you. If you want to go on your own, you can also download that free ebook that is on my website, and it is a hiking guide and photography guide to a bunch of waterfalls that most people don't hear about or know about. So it's the ones that don't make the Google top 10 list, which for me, that's always very enriching.
Please type the link where they can find that as well. Do you ever use graduated ND on waterfalls or just skies?
I definitely use them on the waterfalls. 1 second. All right, it's under the resources tab. So if you just go to the resources tab on my website, then you'll be able to find that ebook. It should be the first thing right at the top. So yes, I do use graduated ND filters for photographing waterfalls. I wish that I had some before and after photos to share with you because I actually have a couple of those. They're just not part of this presentation, but it can have a really powerful effect.
Hey, this is Linda.
Hey, Linda.
Hi, Taylor. I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I lived there for over 30 years and tried to take photos of waterfalls. But it wasn't until I took Taylor's workshop that I learned how to make a beautiful image of a waterfall. And of course, I used my Nisi square filters, and it was just magic. And I have these photos up in my house, and all my friends ooh and ah. So I can't say enough about Taylor and her waterfalls and my Nisi filters. Thanks.
Oh, I love you.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you,
What a
Linda.
testimonial.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up.
Awesome.
So-
Thank you guys so much for coming.
And
Taylor,
please take
quick question
advantage of
for
the
you.
discount.
Oh, someone had a question. Who's that?
Go ahead.
It's Mary. On the Nisi tripod that I got from you, did you ever have any trouble taking them on the airplanes?
No, I never have. Are you talking about as a carry-on?
Yes.
I usually just strap mine right to the outside of the bag. The TSA does permit the transport of tripods domestically, so you shouldn't have any issues with TSA. And yeah, I've never had a
And
problem.
also about the backpack that you carry, because I still got the stuff that you sent
Yeah.
me about it before. But when I looked on, I don't know whether it's United, I'm trying to think of which airline we've got it booked for to go to California. When it said the carry-on, because I can have one carry-on bag and then you can have a personal bag. And for that particular bag, I think it's like 20 inches, 21 inches. And now they're saying personal is 17. Do they really check that?
I've never ever had them check. I mean, there's some small aircraft that it won't fit in the overhead bin, but the bag that
But
I
it fits
sent
right
you,
underneath.
yeah, the f-stop cashmere, it fits perfectly underneath the seat in front of you. So that's why I use
Okay.
that bag and why I don't upgrade to a larger one, because it just fits perfect.
Right, because I've seen some bags that are larger. I'm like, no, I didn't want that. But it's like, I don't want to get to the airport and then for them to go, no, you can't bring it. And you're like, oh. But yeah, okay, cool deal. Because my son is buying us tickets he's in Huntington Beach, California. So we're going there for 2 weeks or so, or 2.5. So of course I want to go, all the places out there, but I want to take everything.
I don't think you'll have any trouble. And anytime I've had difficulty getting my bag to fit in the overhead, I usually am just very, very nice to flight attendant. I'm like, hey, there's some really expensive stuff in here. They always just put it in the closet. There's like an extra little area. It pays to be nice.
There you go. Perfect. Well, thanks.
Yes.
I was going to email you and I thought, I could just ask tonight.
Just ask.
All right, guys. Well, thank you very much, Taylor, as usual. Fabulous. Thank you so much. And next week, we have a woman named Susan Magnano, who does long exposure and light painting. And it's going to be the first time she'll be presenting for us. So I hope we see some of your wonderful names. We don't see your faces, but see your names next week. And please join us. All right. Again, thank you all so much. Have a good night.
Thanks. Bye, guys.